Hi everybody. I will, before I start, give you a warning that I'm from New York and I've had 4 shots of espresso. So I'm hoping that you're used to listening to people speak fast, and if you say you're not speaking fast, just wait, I'll get going in a second. So what I'm going to be talking about today is the future of games and what I see as the future of games. And I am, in case you didn't know, I'm a game designer, which means I don't really work for a living. I make fun for a living, hopefully, when things go well. And when I tell people I'm a game designer, I typically get one of 3 questions. The first question I get is, did you make Minecraft? And the answer is, I didn't make Minecraft, but I sure wish I did. It's a great game. I also get asked this question, do you spend all day playing games? Yep, I do. Now, frequently the games that I'm playing are broken and they're not fun yet, and my job is to make them unbroken and fun. And when that's done, in comes the new game, which is again broken and not necessarily fun. The one I get all the time is when you talk to my kid who's absolutely crazy about games and wants to design games or something for a living. And I will almost always do this, especially if this person is somebody that's underrepresented in games, like a young girl or anybody whose face I would love to see more of. So as a game designer, if you don't know what we do, I'm really an architect of games, right? Like I will draw plans. In fact, this is, as you can see, I'm not artistically talented, which is I guess why I'm a designer and good at math. So this is an example of a level that I would draw for a game. And then the programmers show up and they are effectively the construction workers and they build the level. Then we have the interior designers who show up that we would call artists, and they make the level this beautiful place to be. But a finished game is obviously more than just a finished house, right? Because if we take a look at this house here, what's happening there? So think about if you wanted to throw a party at home. You wouldn't say, please, come sit in my living room, we'll have an amazing night not talking to each other. You would think of something that would be interesting to do. So in essence, I'm a party planner, a professional party planner, and I invite monsters to the parties just to make them interesting. And so you can think about what would happen inside this house? Or say this house, what kind of experiences might you have? Or especially this house, right? They're all very different. So this is me, I'm 5 years old here, an aspiring game designer, although I didn't really know it. And in the States, I'm not sure if you're familiar with this, but for some reason on the weekend we take much of our stuff and we throw it out on our lawn and charge money for it. So my mother, we didn't have, and we had next to no money, so my mother's solution to this was she would say, here, you have a dime. On great weekends, I'd get a quarter. And I would go to yard sales, and for that money, I could almost always buy a board game that was missing its pieces. So I amassed this collection of, and I still have a huge and ever-growing collection of non-digital pieces. And I would make my own games up, not unaware that I was preparing myself for a career. And then this happened when I was 11. So this is Dungeons and Dragons. I still have zero idea why my mother, who was a very devout Catholic, got this for me. I think clearly she just couldn't have known. And it was fine. I mean, other than the occasional goat slaying and listening to Black Sabbath, I've turned out perfectly okay. So anyway, she gets me Dungeons and Dragons, and man, this was the coolest thing that I had ever discovered, because it gave me a way not just to make stories, but to make stories interactive, to take people on adventures. And at this point in time, I was more or less just lost to games. I absolutely loved them. I could not imagine anything else I wanted to do. So I next pick up this system, and this was a little more complicated. So this is, we're probably into the early 80s when I start playing Rollmaster. And it's a group of friends, and we're going out into the dungeon, and I discovered this, and so these aren't the actual rules for encumbrance, but encumbrance, basically the game had a system whereby if you're carrying a lot of armor, you're not moving as fast as you otherwise would move. And it felt like balancing your checkbook in the worst way possible, right? And so I decided to rewrite the rules for encumbrance, which, needless to say, broke the rules for pretty much everything else in the game. So I had to rewrite the entire game, and we ended up playing this game for years. We called it Brenda Law. I threw it away, and man, I wish I still had it, because I'm sure it was utterly terrifyingly bad. But anyway, I wish I still had it. So this slide is interesting. I got my job in the game industry in the bathroom in 1981. So for those of you who have your head in the gutter, please rise up with me now. So here's how it actually happened. I was in the bathroom, and I don't advocate going to bathrooms for interviews, but this is what happened. I walked into the bathroom. I grew up in northern New York, which is under snow most of the year. So if you were a teenager who smoked and you were in high school, remember I played Dungeons and Dragons and listened to Black Sabbath. So you know what else was going to happen? So I was smoking in the bathroom, and this girl comes in, and she's looking for a cigarette, and eventually I realize she's looking for a non-menthol. So I offer her one, and she says, "Do you have a job?" "No." Have you heard of Surtech?" "No." "Have you ever heard of Wizardry?" Also hadn't. "Have you played Dungeons and Dragons?" "Yes, I had," and I got my job. So that was my interview. Truly my interview, and it started on the Wizardry series. So this, I got right in the door there. So this was the first game I worked on. This is Wizardry 1, Proving Grounds of the Mad Overlord, which would also be a great name for the UK right now. This game was, at the time, man, it was state of the art. Those were amazing graphics for 1981. And my mother, so she was like super proud of me, right? I grew up in a single parent household. My mother was unbelievably proud of me. And she thought I was at the forefront of technology, which I really was at the time. Like the Apple II was incredible. So this is 81. And I fell in love with code. If I had to do it twice, I would code it. If I had to do it 3 times, I would code it better. And I even convinced my high school to offer a programming class. Well, they offered it in BASIC, but then they moved on to Pascal. Unfortunately for me, I have this job, so I didn't get to take advantage of as much programming as I would have liked to. And during those years while I was at Surtech, we released a ton of games. I've worked on, I guess, about 40 games altogether at this point in time. And I even put myself through college working on games, not intending at all to go out into the game industry, because at the time in the early 80s, if you said, "Hey mom, I want to be a game designer," if I had even known that was a term, it was a lot like saying, "Hey mom, I want to be a rock star." But my mother, nonetheless, she just thought I was at the forefront of tech and thought that was the greatest thing I could do. And so the game industry largely was me with a whole bunch of guys. And it eventually changed to more women with fewer guys, and so it got a little bit more diverse. And at the company when I started, so I joined this crew of people, and we were half and half. I am not pictured in that, but once I show up, the company's half and half, so it didn't seem odd to me that I wasn't working just by myself. I was working with plenty of other women at the time. And you can see it winnows down, so there's me and one other woman. And so we go from about half to just me and much larger teams. And it felt normal. It felt absolutely normal to me to be surrounded by other guys. In fact, in 2009, I take a job at a company called Slide, which made games for the web. And there were a ton of women in there, and funny enough, man, I felt uncomfortable because I was so not used to being around other women. I mean, we're talking 20 plus years at this point in time where I was frequently the only woman in the company. And so, although since 1981, I feel like, I started actually at tabletop, and I go from the arcades and all the way down to, nowadays VR is the latest thing. It feels like so much has changed technically, but then there's things that haven't changed. And this brings us back to the future of games. And the future of games is what I see as diversity. It is my ability to go into a game world and say, yes, I would like to be a woman. It is my ability to go into a game world and choose a hairstyle that might fit my character. So for instance, does anybody in the audience know what a glabella is? Wow, this is the biggest crew I've ever asked that. And as far as I can see, nobody knows what a glabella is. Glabella. It's right there. Now you've all learned. And the only reason I know what a glabella is because in a game, I had the option to adjust how my glabella looked. But if I wanted to play a black character, because all my children are some shade of brown, if I wanted to play a black character, I had my choice between cornrows and an afro, because clearly there are only 2 hairstyles that a black character might like. And I mean, when I say that, I'm being incredibly sarcastic and insulting directly the makers of these games who do that. So diversity matters. We want to see ourselves in game worlds. And so I'm just going to take a look at it through my perspective, which is really, it breaks down into 3 things. Female avatars. What do we look like in games? Female gamers, and then female creators. So if we take a look at female avatars in games, a friend of mine, Sherry Grainer-Ray, asked this great question: what if the player's female? Like, just whatever game you're playing, what if this particular player's female? Now, interestingly enough, you could not actually be a female in a game world until 1986 with this game, Leather Goddesses of Phobos, tragically. So you couldn't even play a female character until that time. And nothing says, get the hell out. Like, what is your gender in a game? Oh, I get to play a guy, all right. And so, here's an example. This is a game called Ico. I love Ico. It's a brilliant, beautiful game. But in the game, you play this guy, and the girl whose hand he's holding, basically you drag her through the game, right? Like, it's not exactly what I'm thinking I want to do, right? Like, so this is your job as a woman, to be dragged through the game. Or like, if we take Princess Peach, right? Princess Peach will just sit there in the castle and wait for this guy, for a plumber of all things, to show up, right? And so there's, like, what if she rescued herself? Like, thanks, buddy, but I've got this, right? Or what if she rescued somebody, right? Like, that to me would be super cool. And interestingly enough, if you go to Google and you Google game protagonists, this is the first screen that you get. This is the first screen you get, and basically we can tell that if you're a hero in a game world, you need to have at least a little bit of beard. You clearly need to be a white guy, and you need to be just kind of unhappy. So that's the first screen you get. This is the second screen, in case you're curious. So as you can see, it's not terribly diverse. Now, we are getting female characters showing up, and we all want to have to be some kind of hero. We play games not because we want to be taken into the drudgery of life, but to escape for a little bit. It's the same reason maybe why we see action flicks. And so people care about this ability, game designers care about this ability. If you want to be a hero, we want to fulfill that wish. And so if we take a look at heroes, and this comes from Sherry's book, Gender Inclusive Game Design, generally heroes will represent exaggerated signs of physical virility. So for instance, this is the form it takes. In men, we have large shoulders, slim waist, slim hips, long arms, long arms. Now we do. Now they have long arms. So they're gorilla men with long hair. Anyway, with women, I make fun of myself. It's fine. So with women, we have large breasts, typically high on the chest, usually about here, slim waist, round bottoms, and long, thin hair, thick hair. Now, an interesting thing that only happens with female characters is they are sexualized. So when I say sexualized, this is kind of what I mean. And this is an actual screenshot of a character from a game. And I don't know about you guys, but like if I feel my house is under threat, I immediately go for the chainmail bikini, right? Because, I mean, what else is possibly going to protect me in this world, right? And so when I say sexy, what this means is, it means characters have full red lips. They have heavy lids, so they kind of, their lids aren't, wide open. Often there'll be heavy breathing, and these are just the general medical symbols of somebody is aroused, right? And erect nipples, which is probably a phrase you didn't expect to hear today from a game designer, but there you go. Now, interestingly enough, they are the same for men and women, but we only see them on female characters, right? And I know for the women in the audience, yes, it makes me feel like, oh God, that hurts. But these are like, come on, like really seriously, are those actual breasts or water balloons? I mean, it looks bizarre. And these are actual characters from games, right? Like imagine if you were going into a game. Seriously, is this what you want to play? Is this the character I would create? Like, it's ridiculous, especially if you're going into a dungeon to just leave all your clothes off, like you're gonna die. Now, if we contrast this with a couple male avatars, this is what the really cool male guys look like in games, right? They can withstand basically a bomb, like it had dropped in front of them. But for us, we couldn't stand a coffee cup being dropped in front of us. Now imagine if this instead, and let's just linger on the screen for a while. Now imagine if this instead were the avatar choices that guys had. Because really, this is what it feels like if you're a woman playing a game. Now, again, it's getting much better, right? There's lots of characters in games that we're seeing that set great examples and that make me feel like either I am fulfilling a wish or it's a story that I might be interested in. So games have become a lot more diverse. But now if we get to female gamers, right, there's this notion of, well, girls don't really play games, do they? So one of my favorite stories of all time is my daughter, I think she was in 7th grade at the time. In this group of, 7 years old at this time, in this group of boys, when she was in grade school, they let her know that she was talking about a game she really liked, and they said, yeah, the girls don't play games. And so my daughter, being a great kid, dropped the mic and said, my mommy makes them. Good kid. She also won a Super Smash Brothers tournament versus a 17-year-old boy when she was 7. And it was best 2 out of 3, and I'm guessing he's still in counseling at this point in time. So, but if you look at our marketing, right, like this is a picture I took not too long ago, and this is like household appliances, right, packaged for girls. And my daughter, when she asked me, like, Mommy, what is that? Like, she couldn't understand why you would want to play with a vacuum cleaner. And so I answered her accurately. That's gender stereotyping, honey. And an interesting thing that you probably don't know is 93% of game purchases are made by women. 93% of them. And if you're wondering who the hardcore gamer is, I won't ask, but I'm guessing you would say it's a 17-year-old guy who hasn't showered in a week and he's living in his basement. Except it's not. It's a 43-year-old woman. We are the hardcore gamers. We spend more money than anybody on games. So if you are a generally 40-ish-year-old woman and somebody says you're not a hardcore gamer, feel free to correct them because you are. We are the leading demographic for games right now. So this notion that women don't play games and we won't make them, women don't play games, so we need to make them for our audience. And it becomes this very self-fulfilling prophecy, right? So let's take this for instance. This is Project Spark, absolutely great game made by Microsoft. But let's look at the cover. Where's the girl? Like there's a robot and there's a guy. Why can't I be, and there's an alien or something, but there's no girl. And this was a game that all the way through its marketing had been dual targeted at both young boys and girls. Then Assassin's Creed Unity, another excellent example. So Assassin's Creed Unity, you could only play a male character. And the reason you couldn't play female characters is because their boobs were too hard to animate, apparently, right? So as you can imagine, this went over tremendously well. Tremendously well. And so women responded in cosplay, right? Like we're just too hard to animate. It's just crazy. In the game industry, you may not know this, but there is an actual term called jiggle physics. And it's to define how boobs move, right? So this notion of women don't play games, so therefore we need to make them for our own audience. But what if the player is female? Getting back to that question, what if the player is female? So in 2007, it was an absolute watershed moment for me. Now, mind you, I've been designing games since 1981, and my family had no idea what I did. And my niece asked me, she says, "Will you add me on Farmville? I cannot believe that somebody in my family is talking about games." Because usually this is what it means when I would go home for dinner, right? People, they have no idea what exactly that I'm doing, but my niece, she wanted me to add her on Farmville, and Farmville ended up, it just opened the gates to so many players who had never played games before. Those same players that now want more complex and more interesting experiences. And for the first time in my career, I was hearing things like, "We would really like to talk to you because you're a female game designer." Not, "We would really like to talk to you even though you're a female game designer." They wanted my input as if me, who's worked with guys all my life, had some kind of magical, like, "Oh, women want this thing," right? Like, I didn't necessarily have that. But for the first time I was, and women were playing games like crazy. Multi-million dollars, billion dollars, the industry grew and grew and grew. 500 million new players entered the industry from that time. And so yes, they spent an absolutely ton of money on them. And so our market was finally looking diverse as far as players went. Now, it's interesting to say, how is it that we get to 2007 before we really have this explosion of female players? Well, I think it's because you make games based on the mirror that you see. The best games that happen, you make for yourself, right? So, when my husband comes out, he'll talk about Doom. He just wanted to make a great game that he really enjoyed. So if that mirror is only reflecting white men, white straight men, odds are the games are going to be designed for that market as well. Now, there are a couple anomalies. So Nancy Drew, Barbie fashion designer, those products did amazingly well too, and I don't think it's a coincidence, obviously. So this brings me to the last point, which is females making games. So when I first got into the industry, there were 5 women, and I knew all of them. I've basically outlived everybody. Not outlived. At least they're not dead, last I knew. But I've been in the game industry longer than any other woman, which isn't really an achievement. It just means I refuse to change and I refuse to die. So that's how if you just want to be the oldest at something, don't change, don't die. And so there's many other women in the industry. Now I don't even recognize all of them, which is, I think, pretty great. But that said, we're still a shocking tiny minority of what the game industry is or could be. And that's why I would like to see so many more women. And there are studies that show that more diverse teams end up making more diverse games and end up doing better in general. So I would imagine that if somebody were on a team, they may have said, if a woman were on a team, they may have said something like that to this person. And I'll give you a case study. So my husband and I worked on a game called Ravenwood Fair. Now in the game, there's this haunted forest and you're putting back together, your goal is to bring it back to life. And an interesting thing would happen when you would leave the game, creatures would come out of the woods and they'd scare the hell out of your characters, and I didn't like it. Like I wanted my characters to feel safe when I left the game. And so I told him this, and he said to me, well, like, Brenda, you realize nothing's happening in the game, right? Like, when you're away from the game, it doesn't keep running and terrify your little characters. And I mean, yes, I know that, but somehow I still just didn't feel comfortable with the way I was leaving the game. Now, he didn't understand that feeling at all. But he said, explain to me how you feel. And what he ended up doing was creating these things, I've got one circled there, called protectors. And so while you were away, if something theoretically went wrong that it actually couldn't because it wasn't running, you knew your characters were protected. It gave me this sense of interesting closure. And if your characters did get afraid, you could go up to them and sort of cuddle them and they would say, that's okay, right? And it ended up, people love this feature of the game. So if diversity improves our products, how do we improve diversity in the industry? I think first we need to change our marketing. If you go to game industry conferences, you will see things like this. I think those are, for me, that's an aspirational ass, right? I wish I could have an ass like that, but I don't want to see it. Like, I don't want to see it on my way to work. I don't want to see it when I'm talking about contracts. It's just not necessary, right? Women are not means of ornamentation, right? And so it's not something that I want to see. We also need to change perceptions. I hear these things all the time. I'm not good at maths, or IT is for boys. You know, and the reality is that's just not true. For God's sakes, a woman invented programming, right? Like, you know, it's Ada Lovelace. And so we need to really make sure we promote that. Science Foundation Ireland did a study, and they found out when they did this study that the #1 influencer of people's opinions heading into college is their mother. Right? So if we can actually get mothers to say, no, absolutely, math is for you. In fact, you're better at it than boys. Maybe things will change. And studies show girls will do just as well as boys at math unless they're told that they won't. And if they're told that they won't, they don't. So I think we also need to change our culture. The game industry's been in a very exciting fireball to be in for quite a while. There's a lot of things happening that aren't so great. There's been threats to game developers, there's been swattings, there have been information revealed online, and this is really just the stuff you know about. The stories that I've heard that are behind the scenes, and even in my own personal experience, are absolutely terrifying. But ultimately, you know, it comes down to a choice between me pursuing what I love or me giving up my career, which I just, you know, alluding back to wanting to be a fighter, you know, that'll tell you which way that goes. And so when it comes to my experiences with the world at large in games, I ultimately just have to shut all that stuff out because the noise, it just doesn't matter. It can't matter. And I think about these girls whenever I work in a camp or do some kind of course where there's a bunch of girls. This is ultimately why I am doing this. And I go back, like this I have in my office, and it's the most important thing I have in my office. And this was the thing my daughter got me when she was about 9 years old for Mother's Day. And inside it said that I knew I was going to choke up on the screen. Inside it says her goal is she wants to make a game with me. Like that's her dream. Like if she could do anything with me in the future, she wants to make a game with me. So this is this kid now, and we're going to be making that game this summer. So she's hit that age. She's hit that age where she can do that. And, you know, this is the kid who won Super Smash Brothers, and this is the kid who said, Mommy makes games. And this summer, she gets to make them too. And I need to do what I can do for the industry, for the tech industry, to make this a good place for everybody, not just women, right, but for everybody. And for us, too, so that we get the games that we want to play. And I really deeply believe the future of games is diverse. It needs as many different opinions as it can possibly have in order to survive. We can't keep making the same games again and again and again. Thank you.
Enjoy this video from Inspirefest. Then click on the link to get your hands on ultra early bird tickets for Inspirefest 2017 and make sure you're in the audience for this exciting international event.